Thank you so much for joining us today for supporting schools in our communities, a critical foundation to child and youth mental health. This discussion will focus on the role of schools in responding to and supporting child and youth mental health. And we know that schools are represented by many stakeholders. And so we are so thrilled to have a dynamic panel of youth, parent, teachers, school psychology, and research perspectives. And we will be looking through the optimal design for schools to foster child and youth well-being, strengths, challenges, barriers to achieving optimal mental health that have been experienced within our communities, and how we can build comprehensive school mental health systems. I'm Jill Bonenkamp. I'm on the faculty at the National Center for School Mental Health at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. And our center works to advance school mental health research, training, policy, and practice to improve learning and promote success for America's youth. And I'm so thrilled to moderate this discussion today with our dynamic group of leaders, which I'm so excited to introduce you to. I'd first like to introduce you to Alicia Burragata, who's a rising junior at South Fayette High School in Pennsylvania. Alicia, I'll turn it over to you to say hello.
Hi, I'm Alicia Borgata. I am a rising junior in South Fayette High School in Pennsylvania. I have been contributing to mental health since the beginning of my ninth grade year. I'm part of the Work to Be Well Council, National Advisory Council, as well as part of the Teen Summer Working Group in PA Youth Advocacy, and I'm so happy to be here.
Thank you, Alicia. Welcome. And now we'll turn it over to Dr. Sakara Fisher, who's an associate professor of school psychology at University of Georgia.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I have a bit of experience working as a school psychologist in schools, particularly in urban areas. And my research really focuses on the implementation of school-based mental health services and school community partnerships. So I'm excited to be with this panel today.
Thank you, Sakara. Welcome. And now we'll kick it over to Christine Rosati Randall. We are so thrilled to have with us today a parent and grandparent from Killingly, Connecticut. If you want to share more about yourself, Christine.
Thank you. I've been a longtime advocate for children and families in our community and very involved in our schools. I also work for a local early childhood collaborative that serves Northeast Connecticut and has a mental health task force working on issues impacting children and families. And most recently, I have been one of the parents organizing a campaign to bring a school-based mental health center into our high school to address the mental health crisis our students and many students across the country are facing. And that campaign remains ongoing.
Thanks, Christine. Looking forward to hearing more about that as we continue our discussion. And I'm also pleased to introduce Dr. Marisa Windmill, who is an educator at Kent Meridian High School in Kent, Washington.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. I'm so blessed to be here. My name is Marisa Windmill. I've been an educator for almost 30 years. I teach at Kent Meridian High School. This is the most diverse public high school in our state and second in the nation. I recently graduated from doctorate in education, and I'm so excited to share my experience, my skills, and my expertise to explore and advance mental health and to support our students, our scholars. So thank you for being here, everyone.
Thank you, Marisa. And I'm so thrilled to see so many folks introducing themselves in the chat. Exciting to see folks from across the country and internationally joining us today in a variety of different roles. We'll have an opportunity for question and answer at the end, so please feel free to put those questions in the Q&A, and we look forward to this dynamic discussion. All right, so let's go ahead and dive right into us. So to kick us off, our first question that we want to explore is, and we'll start with Alicia. We want to hear from our youth perspective who are on the ground and experiencing this. So Alicia, based on your experience, How should communities be designed to support schools, knowing that they are key stakeholders for child and youth well-being?
Yes, based on my personal experience and as I'm currently going to school, I feel like there's three main components to actually having a stable community that supports supports students' mental health. And one of the strongest bases is having a professional a professional in mental health that can help students. I know many schools do have, like at least my school, they have school counselors, but they have minimal training in how to actually address mental health problems. Having like a school psychologist would be great for students to actually convey their problems more efficiently, and they will also get the efficient responses back, because a professional with more training, but having an undergraduate degree from it and possibly a graduate degree, they know a lot more on how to address these problems rather than someone who has some minimal training for the position. Another thing that I also want to touch base on is that high school and many schools, like all different varieties, elementary, intermediate, middle school, and high school, they all are very, very stressful for students with the extreme number of standardized tests and homework and testing and all of that. I think it's very important for students to deserve a break. So in particular to my school, we do have a club called the Wellness Club. And in this club, we host like monthly activities for students to participate in. One of the activities that I really liked is whenever we wrote on balloons our problems, and then we would pop them. And this also psychologically triggers us to feel that our problems are not everlasting, they will diminish away, and also helps us to relax a bit. And I think every school should have these kind of systems, having some kind of support system for the students to be able to just calm down and divert themselves away from regular school life. And the third thing I also want to touch is the importance of educating the public. Many communities, my school is very diverse with a lot of students from different ethnic backgrounds, and I think that it's very important that teachers and parents and even students be educated about the importance of mental health. And I want to talk more about this in the other parts of this panel, but yeah, that's my stance on this.
That's great. Thank you for kicking us off, Alikia, and for really sharing. I heard you talking about mental health promotion activities that all students can engage in, as well as individualized supports and making sure that there are folks in the building who are trained to be able to do that. I'd love to turn it over to Dr. Fisher to share more about her experience on how school communities should be designed to support schools.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think that with communities, everyone's trying to accomplish the same thing. I think particularly when it comes to like nonprofit organizations or different community organizations, one of the biggest problems that I see though is that there's not a lot of communication between these different agencies within communities. And I think everyone is sort of trying to move forward, but they're sort of wheels moving forward, but on different cars, right? So if there are ways that we can try to get these community organizations to partner with schools to be able to help move things forward through things like coalitions, where you have representation from all of these really key stakeholders for student mental health or community mental health together. If you can think about referral pathways, what are ways that we can identify kids in schools and then connect them to these community partnerships and can keep those pathways going. I think that would be really, really helpful for making sure, because just like Alikia said, while a number of school counselors do have training in mental health, their job descriptions require them to spend more time doing scheduling or things like that. And so because of that, oftentimes there are either issues with getting kids access to mental health, or there are agencies that come inside the schools from the community, often private practitioners, private agencies. But unfortunately, I think sometimes those efforts fall a little flat. And the reason why I say that is because those outside agencies appear to be, they come in, they do the job, they leave. They're not really integrated into what the school's doing or the problems that the kids are having. And so schools have their own processes, right, of identification, of referral. And if someone's coming in and they're not a part of that process, it really divorces what the child's therapy process is from sort of what the school is trying to do to progress them in the school. So I really think integrating and building bridges between these different agencies is really, really important.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I love that idea of integrating and how do we think about making sure those are connected. And I know there are places across the country where that is happening well, lots of lessons that we can learn from other folks. So thank you for highlighting both that resource and community partners and how do we make sure they're really well integrated. All right, I'd love to kick us over to Marisa to share more about, from her perspective, how should school communities be designed to support schools, and especially as we thinking about child and youth well-being.
Well, thank you for that question again, Dr. Jill. I want to emphasize what Alikia and Sakara mentioned already. I think it's very important to put our students at the heart of our education. We have to listen to our students, and we have to put pathways and systems in order for us to support our students. As an educator, I'm a multilingual educator. I have multilingual students and my students from different backgrounds. And so I have to see my students and their intersectionality and their unique needs and their unique strengths. They bring in cultural assets and funds of knowledge that are tremendous. So recognizing the assets of the students that we bring, I think is very important. As a teacher, I make sure that I always put my students at the center of my practice. So getting to know them, building the relationships, because I believe that, students don't care how much you know unless you show them that you care. And my students, having different backgrounds, they come in different points of entries. And so sometimes it's difficult for educators to know students. And so it's like building authentic relationships, making sure that you really are true to yourself and making sure that you communicate with them that you believe in them. But I believe in my role that it is critical. It is very important. Once my student steps in my classroom, it opens up a whole new world. And so how do I open the world for my students from different parts of the world? Knowing that and being aware of my role is really important. And also making sure that I connect with the resources. So who are the people that I can connect my students? Knowing that my students have different needs, who are the people that I need to work with in order for my students to thrive in the school that they are in? I love what Dr. Sakara said about communication. I think it's really important for our system to establish that clear and consistent communication so that we provide access, we provide rigor, and we provide pathways for our students to thrive. So having that established relationships with the community. So it's not just parents, it's not just psychologists, it's not just the principal, it's everyone in the building. It's also about our custodian, our office manager. It's about our cafeteria staff. It's about who we surround our students with. And putting the students at the center is really important. I can give an example of a student who came in my class, and this student never had an education in his country. And so the look on his face was, I couldn't identify what the needs are. But I think the most important thing is to provide that safe environment by just keeping a smile. I think the most important thing is bringing that smile and making sure that student is welcome. So providing that inclusive, safe environment for our student is very important. Starting from the time that they step in our school, to the classroom, to the nurse, to the attendants, to the library, to the cafeteria, and everywhere a student goes in our building, we make sure that we provide that safe environment, welcoming.
Marisa, I love that. So you so eloquently have put the importance of the relationships across the entire school building. And we know we've got lots of evidence that is what supports mental health promotion, and that we all have a role in that. So thank you for so eloquently highlighting that for us. And we'd love to turn this over to Christine to share more about her perspective on how communities should be designed to support schools to promote child and youth well-being.
Thank you. Well, schools are the heart of our community. And if you're not in the school, if you don't have a student in the school, you're not working in the school, you may not know what's really happening in your schools, which affects everybody in the community. And for us, and many communities across the country, our students are facing a mental health crisis. We know the high school years are challenging enough, and then add in a unprecedented pandemic into their short high school experience. And we have a crisis on our hands that's even greater than before. We did a survey. We know that over 28% of our students have had thoughts of hurting themselves. We know that over 14% have actually made a suicide plan. So in response to that, the administration proposed to bring in a school-based mental health center at no cost to the district. And the community at large did not get a vote in this. This vote came before the local Board of Education, and it was voted down. So we began an extensive advocacy campaign to bring in community support. And we have had overwhelming community support for this school-based mental health center, to make sure our students' voices are heard and that they know that there are adults that care, that are fighting for them. This has been going on since February. It remains ongoing. As we get into a deeper dive, we'll talk a little bit more about what those challenges are. We were able to, with the help of our attorney, Andrew Feinstein, able to bring forth a complaint to the state of Connecticut, a 10-4B complaint, alleging that the local Board of Education is failing to implement the educational interests of the state by not meeting the social, emotional, mental health needs of our students, and they're not able to learn. They're not learning if they're thinking about suicide or having a panic attack. And so it was really inspiring to see the overwhelming community support and involvement for this effort. We held rallies, we had news clips, and there's even a video that I think will be put in the chat that highlights our journey that was created by a student to inspire us to keep going. As you know, this can be an exhaustive effort.
Thanks so much for sharing, Christine, about your perspective and experience. And I know we'll continue to discuss more about that as we get into barriers and challenges. But it's so helpful to hear from our panel, youth, parents, professionals in the schools, educators, about the importance of supporting mental health in the schools. And that includes mental health promotion, things we do for all students, teacher-student relationships, all of our relationships in the building, all the way up to our evidence-based treatment services that are available, and some of those successes and challenges that we'll continue to dive in. All right, so thank you, everyone. All right, so thinking about this, I'd love to hear from each of you your experience in school mental health, how schools have supported youth mental health, and really would love to hear some of these successes and strengths. So Sakara, I know you are steeped in this work. Would you like to share some of your successes and strengths for school mental health?
Yeah, I think it's important to kind of first share, hopefully, some of the differences so that folks can have understanding of the differences between like school psychologists, school social workers, school counselors. So I myself, I'm a school psychologist, and often many of you guys may hear of us in a testing capacity where we're identifying people for special education and that sort of thing. But I think some of the strengths that we have as a profession are the fact that we are really, really steeped in data. We love data, we love collecting data, we love evidence-based interventions. And so one of the strengths of this profession that doesn't get tapped into as much as it should is being able to utilize us as a way to evaluate programs, evaluate the strength of evidence-based interventions, research surrounding some of those things, using us to do universal screening for mental health concerns for kids in schools and titrating them to different tiers of intervention to assist with that, and supporting whole school success. And I know when I was working as a school psychologist, we were really just starting to kind of think about what that could look like in the charter school that I was working in. Identifying a universal screener that would be feasible for us to use across all of our middle school grades is what we were doing at that point. And then identifying ways to put them into either small group counseling or individual counseling, or referring them out to some more intense treatment, which a number of kids may need, particularly since the pandemic. I think we've seen an increase in the number of kids who have more serious concerns that are struggling in schools. I also think that in order to utilize the strengths of the school psychologists, right, who do testing, but also have a lot of knowledge around database decision-making, school counselors do have training in dealing with some more general issues with kids. And school social workers dealing more with the home and community connections. I think it's important to utilize all three of those resources together for principals and administrators to identify what each of their professionals know how to do, not what their current job role is, but what do they know how to do, what have they been trained in, and then thinking about how can you utilize the best of that individual, and then either task shift some of the things that other people might be able to do. So like Alikia said, counselors in her school spend a lot of time doing scheduling, but are there other professionals in your building that might be able to do some of that scheduling so that can free the counselor up to really use those skills and training that they have to provide counseling to the students? So I think, there are a number of strengths that professionals, school counselors, social workers, and psychologists have that schools need to use, but I think that there's sometimes limited understanding of what each professional brings, and then also overlap between those professionals. And so increasing collaboration, I think, is really important. And lastly, I guess sort of a success story here that kind of aligns with what Christina is sort of talking about is in the district that I'm working in right now, they are implementing, they actually have a suicidality protocol that they've trained all their school counselors on to really help screen and titrate students who have been experiencing symptoms of suicidality to get them supports and services. And I think that's really great. And the thing that I'm actually working with them on now is developing a similar protocol for substance abuse, because we also know that kids who are struggling with mental health can also struggle with another mental health concern, which is substance use, and end up coping with some of these mental health issues by using different substances. So I think it's important for schools to also think about ways that they can also identify and refer kids, rather than punishing kids who are dealing with mental health, getting them connected to the treatment that they need. And so I'm really excited about the work that's happening here in Clark County School District, the way that they're trying to meet the kids' needs through the training. And I'm looking forward to my continued work with them.
Thank you, Sakara. I so appreciate you walking through some of those roles of many of our mental health professionals already in the schools, and how do we make sure we're taking advantage of those, and especially for sharing some examples of that working well. I'd love to kick us over to Marisa to share more about successes in her role in her school community as it relates to supporting youth mental health.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I'm an educator, so I always put my students in the heart of my practice. I would say I am good at building relationships. So ways that I build a relationship with my students are really getting to know them. And one way of doing that is journaling. I make sure that I'm vulnerable with my students, so I share my story. And there are different ways for them to share their own too. So one is writing, one is just having conversation. I make sure that I provide space for them to really talk about themselves, about their struggles. And I think really talking about myself, modeling how to be vulnerable is really important. I walk the talk. So like when I tell them that, we cannot give what we don't have. And so the first thing that I do is making sure that I do have my routine and I do have some practices to maintain my mental health. And how I do that is I share with them my schedule, what I do in the morning, what my routines are. I do my devotional reading, I write my journals, I do have gratitude journals, and I plan my day. Especially during the pandemic when I had to do so much going to the graduate school, serving in different committees and teaching. I said, I'm able to teach you and help you because I have routines. I make sure that I prioritize myself. So how do you do that? So students really open up when they are, they know that I trust them and they know that I am vulnerable. I think it's critical because my students really tell me that, Mrs. Windmill, I know that I can share this with you because you listen to us. And I think for teachers, it's really important for us to listen and to make sure that we pay attention to their needs are. Our state, I'm lucky that our state actually implements social emotional learning. So we make sure that we have, that's part of our routine, that we have social emotional learning. But I go beyond social emotional learning. It's part of my practice. Upon entry, mid of the lesson, and towards the end, there's always that part where I make sure that I check in with my students. I'm also, I would say, I'm proud that our state actually also has revised our student growth goal, the teacher evaluation, where we center our students using cultural responsive teaching, knowing that students have cultural assets, and then partnering with parents, with guardians, with a community in order to set goals for our students. So I would say these are proactive approach that we are utilizing at our state, and also creating this conversation. We call it the circles. So I think some of our districts now are using the MTSs, restorative circles, where students really share their thinking. We also have some surveys that we provided our students, and I think through that survey, we're taking this proactive approach where we are really focusing on the assessment. So based on the assessment, based on the survey, based on the student voice, what can we do as educators? And students say this, and Alike, I know that you mentioned this. We need to, students know what they need. And so if they listen to them and really act based on what they said they need, it's critical. Kristen, being parent, I think we need to partner with you. We need to partner with our parents because they know better. Our students' aspirations start from home. And so how do we listen to our parents? I always ask questions to parents when I have, parent conference. I ask them, what makes your child happy? What are your child's aspirations? And for me, that's important because I know what resources I can provide for my students. And although the resources are not available, I always find resources. I break boundaries for my students. And I tell my students that I will do everything to help them thrive. And I won't let them fail because that's my purpose. And so my students trust me. And I think that's important for us to say that, because one way for them to thrive is to really have someone who believes in them. And there are many ways, of course.
Thank you, Marisa. And I'll continue to put into the chat. I've heard folks talk about MTSS and social emotional learning, and I'm going to put lots of resources coming in the chat. There's plenty of free resources if you want to learn more about all of these things and implementing them in your communities. But I'd love to turn us over to Alikia to talk about successes. I heard you talk about some of those in your introduction, but other ones you've seen that really help to support youth mental health.
Right. I would first start off by saying Marisa actually took my point of one of the biggest strengths that youth have is that we know what we really need. Like, we are the ones that are going to school facing the struggles or facing, like, going through the pressure, like the oppression of the school system kind of thing, because all the workload and stuff. So we really know what we need. And I think I have friends who had mental health problems, and I was there for them emotionally. And I think many students can also relate to that. Like, if any of their peers are struggling with mental health, we are here to, like, emotionally support them. But also that also takes account that if you are here, like, if you're always listening to someone else's story, because we're not professionals, we can't really deal with that as much. Like, we would also that will be also detrimental for our own mental health. And I think that's why it's so important to have professionals in the school area to help students with this. In regards to the biggest strengths that my school has, yes, I did mention about the wellness club that has recreational activities, but another one that that is also in my school district is the Students Against Destructive Decisions, or SAD, SAD with SADD, two Ds. In that club, we basically talk about ways like how teen actions or teen like decisions can actually have effects on the family, like as suicide or any kind of harm towards themselves. That not only affects the individual itself, but it also impacts all of the people that are around him. It affects his peers, or like his friends, or his or her friends, and his or her family as well. And I think that's why my school's biggest strength is that there's a lot of already knowledge, like a lot of teachers and counselors that do have the knowledge that mental health is very, very crucial to to students, and how they should be addressed, and how to kind of identify some problems with them. But the thing that I think we're lacking is that how to address these problems. Yes, they are able to identify students who are struggling, but they don't provide enough resources to actually take into account or actually help the students out. And I think that's the thing that we need to work on into the future.
Thank you for highlighting some of those strengths and so awesome things that are happening in your school, and then also some of those barriers. And we're going to start to, we'll kick it over to Christine to talk about some of the strengths and successes she's seen, and then also roll us right into some of those barriers as well. So Christine, if you want to share some of the strengths and successes, and then also start to share some of the barriers in getting this accomplished.
Well, although we do have a lack of mental health supports and resources across our district and all of our schools, we have had amazing response from our staff in all of our buildings, helping these students feel supported, helping elevate the student voice so that they feel heard. And although they might not be feeling like they're heard from the Killingly Board of Education, certain members, they do feel like they're being heard from the overwhelming community. As I said before, we held rallies. We held 3 different rallies. And it inspired people. They formed a bond. They felt unified and organized. In doing this, students came and they spoke during public comment at Board of Education meetings, which is very difficult even for an adult. Staff came and spoke in support of the students at every meeting over the span of months. Staff accompanied a couple students to the State Board of Education meeting, along with some parents, and spoke in front of the State Board of Education to educate them about what's happening here in Killingly with the school-based health center. They supported these students in getting in front of news cameras and sharing their story. And it was really inspiring to see the unified effort working towards bringing the service in for students. And I think the takeaway that's really positive is that the students are learning effective advocacy. They're learning that if you have a need, how to speak up for it in a very effective and positive way. They've learned how to write letters to the editor, how to send emails to your local elected officials, how to do public speaking. We all wore green in solidarity. They had at the school, they had bought Mental Health Matters t-shirts, and they wore them on specific days. And then at the graduation, their students organized all wearing green ribbons in support of mental health. They even decorated their caps and gowns. So it was really nice to see that. But the challenge is that we still don't have a school-based health center. The students will be returning to school, and that support is not in place. The state of Connecticut is investigating, and they will be holding a meeting with the chair of the Killingly Board of Education to get answers as to why they are going against a proposal they initially voted for and included in their grant application. But I found from the onset, the problem was disinformation. So that's the real challenge. Again, if you don't have community members that are in the school that see what's happening, several of our board members don't have children in the school district. One of them homeschools their child. one of them has not ever stepped foot into the school. So how do you know what's going on if you're not listening to the students, the staff, or the parents? So at the onset of this, we had our state representative, Van Dauphiné, who is considered, an elected official, a leader in the community that should be in the know, put out a survey with disinformation implying that a school-based health center does things that it does not do. And so we had to change that narrative. Her husband organized a counter rally against students who were out rallying for themselves. So that was another challenge. And the most recent one was they organized a meeting in July at their home, our state representative and her husband, who's the chair of the Quiet Corner Tea Party Patriots, to educate and inform the community about why the school-based health center is bad, but neither one of them has mental health credentials, and really it's dangerous to be informing the community about something you're not knowledgeable about. So that's the barrier. We're still fighting for this. We plan on organizing a rally in Hartford because it's in the state's hands now. The state has the ultimate authority. So we're going to bring our advocacy campaign to the state and call on them to intervene if ever there was a case to step in. We think it's here in Killingly, and mental health matters can't wait. And our students really need to have these supports in place, and the staff needs to have resources so when a student comes to them, they have they can send them to the mental health center that's right there in the school. Our staff has done an amazing job with these students, but they need resources themselves. And we're concerned that, they could get burnt out. And we have actually lost staff because of this.
Thanks so much, Christine, for sharing some of those barriers and challenges, but also how you're addressing them. And we continue to wish you luck in those efforts and continued support. Thanks for dropping that in the chat. So Sakara, could you share briefly about just some barriers you've encountered?
Yeah, I think barriers for sure are just the lack of professionals in this field that are able to provide services. So those of you who have introduced yourself or have not, that are actually in the pipeline to do some of this work, thank you. Yay. I just wanted to kind of give a sense of how dire the disparity is. So here in the state of Georgia, the recommended ratio for school psychologists is 1 for every 500 students, just nationally. And here in Georgia, there's 1 school psychologist for every 6,390 students. Their recommended ratio is 1 social worker for every 250 students. Here in Georgia, there's 1 social worker for every 5,272 students. And then for school counselors, the recommended ratio is 1 school counselor for every 250 students. And in Georgia, there's 1 school counselor for every 447 students. So you can see that we are really way off the sort of national organization's recommendations for the number of professionals that can really be there to support and provide mental health services for kids in our schools. And I think that is a huge challenge. It's really just having the number of people going through the pipeline that can provide services. And this is just for school-based mental health professionals. We know that there's an even bigger gap or a similar gap in community-based services. Another thing that I think is difficult is the utilization of, I think I've said this before, of the time. Professionals who are in schools, there's so many other things pulling them into different directions. So, counselors are doing scheduling, school psychologists are doing IQ and achievement assessments, social workers may end up doing more house calls and attendance, which are important, but it pulls away from the time to really provide mental health services. And then I guess lastly is really just thinking about the training that our school counselors, social workers, and psychologists have in some ways. A number of them get sort of basic training of really being able to provide supports. And a lot of times the guidelines around behind providing mental health services in schools is really not to dig into the deep stuff, right? It's really, we want to provide enough support so that the child is able to function academically within school. So we're not trying to get deep into trauma. We're not trying to get deep because we have to send the kids back to school. right? How do we send a kid back to class to learn? And you sort of unearthed all this stuff, right? So part of the challenge is, what is the time and the place to be able to talk about some of the more intense things that kids might really need help with? But then also, how do you connect with services, like I mentioned before, that can really dig into some of that deep work and do the work that students need us to be able to do? So training, timing, resources, I think are all, and administrative support. I think is critical, and making sure this can happen, as Marisa talked about, like making sure that everyone in the building is on the same page, making sure that administration, it starts with administration valuing the fact that these professionals can provide these services, valuing the fact that kids may need to be pulled out of classes to get mental health services, and that time is just as valuable as maybe the reading time or the math time that they missed, so that when they come back, they can actually access that information. Because if they're anxious or depressed, right, how are they really going to be able to retain and get that information? So I think all of that is super important. And I will include the link in the chat for Teresa. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sakara, and for highlighting many of those barriers. And so if Alikia and Marisa could just maybe highlight any other top barriers that you didn't hear there, and make sure we have time for questions coming in we've seen from folks.
Yeah, I can go really briefly. So I think the biggest challenge is that even though psychologists, counselors are available, I think the biggest challenge is actually having the students and the communities actually go to them. I think there's mental health is a very taboo topic in many communities, including my family as well. It was a prevalent issue, and it still is. Like, it takes a lot of convincing for students to actually convince their parents that it's real. It's not just a fake thing. It's not just that you're not just faking it just to skip work or anything. It's actually a really important topic. And I want to point out to a specific quote I found from a professor in University of Chicago's magazine. She says, among some immigrant and refugee families, discussions of mental health problems or mental health is taboo due to cultural perspective that mental illness signifies being crazy or mad, thereby preventing families from seeking help because of fear of bringing shame to the family. I think this is what is very common in several communities, especially immigrant families and refugee families, because they are not enough, they're not as educated enough to, they're not educated in the perspective of mental health. They know things about others, like they know great things about other stuff, but they don't know enough about mental health to actually shine interest or show like concerns about their kids facing these problems whenever they are actually facing it. And I think that's one thing that we need to really work on by actually educating the community about it.
Thank you so much for highlighting that. Go ahead, Marisa.
Well, thank you, Alikia, because I was going to talk about that. Our school serves about more than 200 refugee students. And so that's very common when I meet with families. I think educating our families when it comes to the benefits of mental health and the supports that we can get from our resources is really important. So educating our families. And I would say also another thing is access, especially when it comes to language. Our families need to be provided with language access. Sometimes they don't know what they don't know because of the language. If we're proactive when we approach it in a way that our families actually have a lot of assets. And so if we inform them about these benefits of knowing what their mental health status is, it actually helps them to be their best, to be at their best, to shine, to really show that they are more than capable. Because a lot of times we see our students, especially our refugee students, as a deficit. We think that because they don't have the language or the culture that we expect them to have, they actually do have culture, rich language, rich in everything, I would say. And so how do we, as educators, as schools, as an institution, recognize the assets that they're bringing and see them as assets to our community that they can contribute. I would say if we do that, then we can really thrive. I would say I have 3 students right now they were in my classroom. They came as refugee students, but now they thrive. I was able to connect them to resources. One of them became our state page. And they all got scholarships. And because I was able to recognize them, I was able to see their assets, they were able to thrive. And I'm excited to see how they will contribute to our community. I think if we look at our students based on the assets they're bringing, we are going to have a beautiful world.
I love the strengths-based approach and answering our next question around, what are some of the needs of unique groups within our school populations? And I think Alicia and Marisa, you both highlighted some of those. Turn over to Christine and then Sakara. Are there other unique needs that you see within distinct populations?
Sure. For us, we're in rural Northeast Connecticut, and transportation is a barrier. There are families that have no vehicle, or there's working families that share one vehicle. Even if you have a vehicle, you may not get time off to take your child to an outside appointment for mental health support. But we're living in a mental health desert. Our region just does not have enough private providers for us to bring our children to, which is why we were moving toward the school-based health center model. Generations Family Health Center was going to come in. They're well known in the community. They have an established relationship in the community. And although they have some openings currently, how do you get there? Right now, the way the school is designed, if a child is in crisis, they have to call 211, which is our info line. The parent gets called, and then they generally end up going to the ER because there isn't a provider that can see them. And so it's very challenging for families, for working families, single parent families. We're not an affluent area of the state. And the school-based health center, we just keep coming back to that model because it just works for families. That parents can telehealth in if they can't leave their job, or they have other children at home that they're caring for, because this affects the entire family, not just the child in crisis.
Thank you so much, Christine, for highlighting the many strengths of having school-based services, and especially the school-based health centers. Sakara, any other considerations for unique groups?
Yeah, just I guess the last thing I want to say is I echo everything that everyone has been saying about these unique groups, but I also want to add that things like implicit bias and zero tolerance policies really disproportionately affect minoritized populations when school personnel see behaviors as deviance versus mental health needs that need to be addressed. And I think it's really important for people to really take a look at themselves and take a look at the behavior from an objective, unbiased lens to see whether or not that behavior is from, anxiety or depression or something else that's going on, particularly for minoritized kids, because I think oftentimes those kids can be sort of set as bad, right? And we start this whole school to prison pipeline that we hear so much about. So I think mental health services, particularly for minoritized populations, is one of the answers to really trying to interrupt this school to prison pipeline that we hear so much about. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for flagging that. It's a critical point as we're considering how to make sure we're meeting all students' needs and having schools be supportive places. So please feel free to put questions in the Q&A or in the chat. We're just about to turn to our question and answer. But Alicia, anything else you wanted to share, or Marisa, about unique groups and considerations?
Well, I would say, we're getting more diverse, and diversity, equity, inclusion is a big thing. And we know that representation matters. I think it's very important for our community, school community, to recognize the needs of really diversifying educator workforce. We know that educators of color really can connect with our students, with our diverse background, with our students who have diverse backgrounds. And research supports that when a teacher of diverse backgrounds teach students of the same group, they thrive. And so, and then really looking at how do we support diversity? looking at how, not just checking off the box, how do we support diversity and really putting systems in place to really support our diverse community, our educators who are diverse. We do a lot of things for our students when it comes, especially during the pandemic. I was able to form groups with the community. I was able to work with the community and support our students, and it works. So I hope that we continue really supporting, advancing the diversity through systems.
Thanks, Marisa.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Alicia.
What I was thinking is, yes, you pointed out diversity, which I talked about previously. I think another thing that causes a barrier to actually getting adequate mental health care is probably like financial issues. I think a lot of communities, especially after the pandemic hit, there's a lot of people in my community that probably have been affected financially with have been affected financially. And I think that mental health should be accessible for everybody, like no matter the socioeconomic status or financial status. I think it should be very accessible. If it's offered in schools, I think it should be like obviously it will be given free and accessible for all students. But if they want to seek out additional help in the community, such as going to a therapist or a professional psychologist outside of the school, I think they should be a little bit more accessible. In regards to, I would say like how that would be possible would be probably like decreasing some costs or giving some kind of discounts to students in such like financial crises, like families in financial crises. And I think that will be very helpful for students and families as well.
Thank you, Alicia. It makes good sense to think about that. And so now turning to our question and answer, we had a question come in for any recommendations for policies that would make a difference and support mental health in their communities, either policies that you've seen in action or recommendations just through your work. Anyone have any thoughts that wanted to kick us off for that? And maybe while folks are thinking, I'll just highlight, and then Sakara, turn to you, that our National Center for Mental Health has a policy map on school mental health policies across the country. So I'll drop that in the chat for folks to look at, where you can see example policies. Sakara, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, the only one that I could think of that I thought was really interesting was one that I know has been passed in Massachusetts, where I believe like the nursing agency or professional organization in Massachusetts pushed for a policy to be passed for them to do universal screening for substance use issues within their schools. And I think policies like that, because screening is really what really helps catch kids, especially those kids who are internalizing with their behaviors. A lot of times they aren't going to be the squeakiest wheel, right? And so if we can put in our policies to make sure that we are screening kids for certain issues and then have plans for getting them connected to resources, I think that's really critical and key. And I think it's been really helpful in the state of Massachusetts, just seeing some of their manuals and policies and procedures that that state's going through. Seems like it's been pretty successful in providing supports and getting kids to the supports they need.
It's a great example, and I know I put this link in for the chat. Minnesota has done amazing work in terms of state level policy, so check out some of their policies. Michigan as well. Thanks so much, Marisa, for putting in critical, and I'll let you speak to that out loud because this is critical national policy. Go ahead.
Well, I was, thank you, Dr. Jill. I just read this yesterday because in our state, we actually have a law that we have to implement social-emotional learning. And we've been really good at implementing social-emotional learning. But I think we need to be consistent in doing that in our classroom, in our practice every day. And not just in the classroom, but in the entire school. I think leadership has an important role to do when it comes to implementing social-emotional learning. I was looking at a policy in our state level when I came across this announcement from the President Biden-Harris administration. There are 2 new actions to address youth mental health crisis. And so adding more counselors and staff who can really provide support for our students So feel free to read the link because I think it's important. It's going to be given to school districts and it's competitive, but I think, I'm thinking, how can we make it not competitive and making sure that it's every school district is supported in a way that it is systematic and intentional? Because sometimes, there are districts who don't have the capacity to apply for grants or who have the capacity but don't know how. So it's really important for us. I think the biggest resources that we have is human resources. So how do we tap in the resources that we have already? I think everyone in our building, in our community, plays an important role. So how do we tap in? How do we cultivate the capacity and the expertise of people in our community so that we can support each of our students and help them thrive?
Thank you so much, Marisa. So as we start to go towards our end of the hour, I would love to just give a moment for each of our panelists to share some concluding thoughts. We've had some additional questions come in via our Q&A, which we'll respond to, or panelists, as part of your concluding remarks, please feel free to share answers to some of these questions you see coming through here. But let's kick it over to Alekia to share some closing remarks.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about the previous question about what PA is currently doing, or like statewide kind of things to pass mental health support for students. And I think my current work with the Jewish Healthcare Foundation and PA student advocacy or mental health advocacy, we are currently trying to establish mental health days in schools. Mental health days will be like a great benefit for students to just take per semester, maybe 2 to 3 days when they are very stressed out or burnt out, to just take a break and calm down and spend an entire day just for themselves, away from all schoolwork. I think this is a great way for students just to distract themselves, similar to the recreational activities that are offered my school, but not all of PA is kind of like that. So I think this was a great help, and that's what we are currently doing. Some of my remarks is that this panel was really amazing. I got a lot of new insights, and I'm really hoping that all of your endeavors will succeed. All to the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alekia. Christine?
I just want to step back to the question about policy. So the Connecticut General Assembly in this past legislative session has elevated the mental health crisis. They have recognized it. They have taken steps to address it across the state. And one of the things that they did was the Connecticut Association of School-Based Health Centers did a needs assessment and identified Killingly specifically as a mental health desert in one of, I think, 30-something communities that would be eligible for grant funding to bring school-based health centers into the community. The challenge still remains that there are 6 Board of Education members that are saying no to the school-based health center. So we can't access that funding, but they're also not talking about viable alternatives. They have a special Board of Education meeting this Wednesday, I believe, tomorrow actually, to talk about bringing in armed security officers to address the mental health crisis. And so really, educating policymakers is important. If we have a policymaker that's disconnected, we're not going to have good policy. We're not going to have good decisions. So we will continue to work on that. We will continue to shine a spotlight on that. And if anyone can help in any way, continue this conversation for our students. It's greatly appreciated. And thank you for everyone that's joined this webinar.
Thanks, Christine. And Sakara?
I just wanted to thank everyone for coming and participating in this panel, asking your great questions. I'm happy that I could serve as a part of this panel. And if anyone has any additional questions for me after the panel, please feel free to check my bio and reach out to me with any additional questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thanks, Sakara. And Marisa?
Well, I do appreciate this space. Thank you so much for being here. I would say be the change you wish to see in this world.
Thank you, Marisa. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. If you are interested in continuing, Rachel has put some additional links. Please check out our work at schoolmentalhealth.org. We cull resources from across the country. And just thank you all for all that you do to really support our youth. This is so critical as we move forward. Huge thank you to our esteemed panelists and to the network for hosting this session. I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and thank you so much for joining us.